Yo, what's up? Dr. Swole here, MD bodybuilder, back with another video. Today we're going to be talking about intensity techniques. Now this is a difficult time for bodybuilders or people who want to build muscle because a lot of gyms are closed and people don't have access to heavy weights. The main difficulty people are having with at-home workouts right now is it's difficult to get enough intensity. In other words, making training difficult enough. Now the current literature suggests that you should be training with more than at least 30% of your 1 rep max in order to maximize the hypertrophy stimulus from your sets. Exercises should be hard enough so that you can only get about 30 reps. And right now the scientific community is saying that we should be generally getting at least within 4 reps shy of failure. Now let's say that you are able to load, say, Bulgarian split squats or lunges or push-ups enough so that you actually get near failure at 30 reps. The problem with that, as many of you might know, are that high rep sets are very mentally taxing. Today we're going to be talking about intensity techniques for bodybuilding. Now, these will have special application right now during the lockdown situation, but they do have some utility in normal training, and you might want to end up incorporating them in your everyday programming. I'll be explaining the various techniques and how they work, and then we'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages of these techniques. And finally, I'll give some recommendations on how you might implement these techniques even in your usual gym programming. So if that sounds good to you, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and let's get into it. Just to introduce the general categories of the techniques we'll be talking about today, they fall into pre-fatigue, metabolite training, increased movement difficulty, and tempo. Okay, so the first intensity technique we're going to talk about is Myo Reps. These are also known as rest pause sets, cluster sets, or DC training. There are different ways you can implement this, but the basic idea is that you're doing multiple sets at the same weight where you take very short rest periods in between to make subsequent sets harder. The way you implement the classic Myo Reps style is that you'll initially do an activation set where you get to near failure, say around 1 rep shy, and then you'll stop and take a 10 to 20 second break before going back for another set. After the second set, you'll take another 10 to 20 second break and then repeat. The idea is that the activation set will pre-fatigue your muscles so that in subsequent sets, you don't need as many reps to get to failure. So in our Bulgarian split squat example, let's say you did 30 reps on the first set. On the second set, you typically only get about a third to 1/2 of the reps that you got on the first set. So from our example, let's say you got 30 reps on the first set. In the second set, you might go down to 15, and the set after that maybe down to 13, and so on. Now there has been some research on rest pause sets, and it has been shown to be equally effective for hypertrophy compared to straight sets. And it's based on the recently termed effective reps model. What the effective reps model says is that the reps closest to failure are the most stimulative for hypertrophy. So in other words, if you're doing a set of 30, it's really those last 4 or 5 reps that are contributing the most to hypertrophy. So why not just skip those reps beforehand and jump right into those high intensity reps by shortening your rest times in between. Now it doesn't exactly work like that you can just ignore those earlier reps. They do contribute somewhat to hypertrophy, so to make up for this, you'll have to do more rest pause sets than you would do straight sets. However, this does present an advantage in that it's very time efficient. Say I would normally do 4 straight sets of an exercise. With Myo Reps, I might do in 1 activation set plus 5 or 6 cluster sets following that. Now the disadvantage with Myo Reps is that by pushing your body close to failure again and again, you're generating a lot of fatigue, which might impact the amount of volume you can produce or affect subsequent workouts. Now, my recommendation for general gym programming for Myo Reps is that it's useful for people who are short on time. So say if you don't have time for your full workout on a certain day, or if you're in the gym and they suddenly announce that they're going to be closing soon, know that you can fit in some very productive training in a short amount of time. I'll also note that in general, this technique is most useful on isolation type movements. If you're trying to use this technique with, say, heavy barbell squats, you're going to generate so much cardiovascular and systemic fatigue that you'll be destroyed for your subsequent training. Now the next technique we're going to talk about is pre-exhaustion. Now this is taken from the bodybuilders of the old school, where you would typically start off with an isolation movement followed by a compound movement, and you would often do these in supersets. An example of this might be for the chest. You might say start with dumbbell flies followed by dumbbell bench press. This can be particularly useful for those people who might only have access to light weights. So let's say that you can normally dumbbell press 70 or 80 pounds, but at home you only have access to 30-pound dumbbells. What do you do? An example of using the pre-exhaust technique would be that you take your 30-pound dumbbells and start off with a set of dumbbell flies and immediately follow that set with a set of dumbbell presses. Now, the advantage of this is that you can reduce the total amount of fatigue you're producing because you're avoiding those heavy weights that you would normally be pushing on the compound movement. This is somewhat debated in the scientific community right now, but the disadvantage is that you could potentially be reducing the total amount of volume and possibly stimulus that you're producing for hypertrophy. Because if you look at volume in terms of sets times reps times weight lifted, you're reducing the amount of weight lifted on that compound movement that follows the isolation movement. My recommendation for using pre-exhaustion in typical hypertrophy programming is that I would generally save it for more advanced lifters who need to maximize the amount of stimulus they get for the amount of fatigue they produce. For highly advanced bodybuilders, let's say if you're benching 400 pounds for reps, that's going to produce a lot of connective tissue and joint stress that might be avoided by doing a pre-exhaustion isolation set and then using lighter weights on the compound. Okay, the next couple of techniques are going to deal with metabolite training. Basically, when you're doing high rep sets and you get near failure, you feel this burn in your muscles that is produced by the accumulation of these metabolic byproducts, things like lactate, which might play a role in hypertrophy. The science isn't very conclusive right now, but I think these techniques are worth a try. The first one is blood flow restriction training. This has been shown in the literature to produce a good hypertrophy response, and the way you do it is that you'll be wrapping the proximal limb, so the base of your arm or your legs, to reduce the return of venous blood flow. Note that you're not blocking off arterial blood flow. You shouldn't see your limbs going purple or having any numbness or tingling. This works out to a tightness of about 7 out of 10 on a subjective scale. You would typically use this technique on exercises where you would normally do more than 15 or 20 reps. You'll do your initial set to about 15 to 30 reps, and you want to get close to failure, say around 1 rep in reserve. Then you'll stop and take a short rest, like 30 to 60 seconds, and you'll go again. The idea is that by blocking venous return, you're having blood pool, which will lead to the accumulation of these metabolic byproducts. Furthermore, you'll get a massive pump from this, and it's been proposed that the pump itself might have a causal role in hypertrophy. A handy trick that I found to work well for BFR is that you can take a rope from a local hardware store and use that instead of blood flow restriction bands. Now, the advantage of this technique is that you're minimizing connective tissue stress since you're using such low weights. The disadvantage is mainly just because it's very painful. You're basically finding ways to intensify the burn. It can also be a little bit tricky since you're only able to wrap the proximal arm and legs. It really only works for your biceps, triceps, quads, hamstrings, and calves. Now, in terms of my recommendations for year-round programming, I think this is most useful for athletes who are working around injuries or chronic aches and pains, because you're still getting a good hypertrophy response while minimizing connective tissue stress and muscle damage. Now, the next metabolite technique we'll talk about is drop sets. And the way you implement these is that you'll push a set close to failure, and then you'll drop the weight to about 1/3 to 1/2 of what you were previously lifting and immediately jump into another set. I usually aim to get about 6 to 20 reps in my drop sets. Drop sets essentially work in the same way that blood flow restriction training does, in that it increases the amount of metabolites building up in your muscles. So you can hit a few heavy sets like the old bodybuilders used to do, and then continue doing sets with little to no rest. The disadvantage, however, is that you produce a large amount of fatigue since you're pushing yourself so close to failure so many times. And I would say that in general, the science is somewhat against drop sets because you produce a lot of fatigue and you're actually not performing a lot of volume. However, most of the research we have on hypertrophy right now is based on beginner athletes. And there are a lot of pro bodybuilders who have had great success using high intensity techniques like drop sets. So I would generally reserve this training style for more advanced athletes or people who are really short on time. Okay, the next few techniques are going to deal with exercise tempo. In other words, how quickly you go through different portions of the lift. And we'll start off with the concentric part of the movement with explosive reps. Now just think of this as moving the weight up as quickly as possible. If you're at home training, think of this as getting air time on your movements. So say clapping push-ups or jumping lunges. An advantage of this style of training would be power development, which might have an application in developing your strength. The disadvantage, however, is that you're reducing the amount of eccentric loading you're putting on the muscle. Because basically by exploding through the concentric portion of the rep, you're increasing the tension on that concentric portion but you're not increasing it on the eccentric portion, which has been shown to have an important role in hypertrophy. So in general bodybuilding programming, I typically wouldn't use these. My recommendation would be to use them for athletic development. So say if you're a powerlifter, a CrossFitter, or if you play some other sport. The next tempo technique we're going to talk about is the use of pauses. Now you can use these at different portions of the movement, either at the most difficult portion of the movement or at the part of the movement where your muscles are most stretched. But the advantage of using pauses is that it ensures that you have good control of the weight you're lifting. It can also make exercises more difficult. So let's say you can only load up your suitcase at home to 50 pounds and you want to train your back. You can still do rows and just pause at the top of the movement for say 1 to 4 seconds. The disadvantage of using pauses is that they can be awkward on certain movements. My recommendation for pauses is to use them for technique development because they really make sure that you're loading the target muscle. My favorite exercises to use pauses on would be lateral raises and calf raises. So for lateral raises, you pause at the very top of the movement. It really forces you to be in control of the weight and minimizes cheating. And for calf raises, I like to pause at the bottom of the movement and at the top of the movement to really ensure that I'm targeting my calf muscles effectively to take on the load. All right, our last technique here is to use slow eccentrics, and this is basically where you just slow down the lowering portion of the lift. The advantages and disadvantages are going to be similar to using pauses. Basically, you're just trying to increase the amount of time that your muscle is being tensioned. This might be useful for you if you don't have access to heavy weights and you need to make your workouts challenging with what you have. So to implement this, I would elongate your eccentric phase of the movement to about 2 to 5 seconds. In general bodybuilding programming, slow eccentrics can have an application because they really ensure that you have control of the movement. However, with the pauses and eccentrics, if you do have access to a gym, I wouldn't say that they're any better than to just doing more reps. If you're doing slow eccentrics or pauses, and let's say each rep takes 3 times the amount of time, you may as well just do 3 times the number of reps. So they can be useful for variation, but it's not something I would say is necessarily better. That's all for now, guys. Thanks for watching. If you found this useful, make sure you leave a like and comment below. Let me know if you have used any of these intensity techniques and what you thought about them. I've replied to every single one of my comments, so make sure you let me know if you have any questions. If you're looking for a full bodybuilding program, I outline some free full training programs that are science-based and are organized in a number of different splits like full body, push-pull legs, and upper-lower. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't and hit the notification bell so you can hear about my next video when it drops. See you next time.